Vietnam remains dedicated to expanding and modernizing its economy. Here's some more facts. The GDP grew 5.5% last year. The International Monetary Fund expects 6% this year. Now, helping Vietnam are the strong exports and also a booming manufacturing sector. Vietnam joined the World Trade Organization in January of 2007, a move which has promoted more competitive export-driven industries. In 2010, it became an official negotiating partner in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But the country faces challenges with public investment, state-owned enterprises, and also in the finance sector as well. Recently proposed reforms meant to address those issues are behind schedule. For more on the economy, Marc Mealy, he's the Vice President of Policy at the U.S. ASEAN Business Council. He joins us back again. Thank you again. First of all, thank you.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Vietnam, it is by far one of the most incredible success stories we have. I mean, I'm excluding China in this particular discussion, but a lot of people are amazed what they've accomplished, and people forget that they're not in India. It's still a communist government, so they had to really make some very significant steps and reforms to get to where they are today. How did they do it politically?
I think politically, the choice was really made for this kind of basically movement towards a more of a market-oriented economy. And the one thing you can say about the Vietnamese government, when they do make a choice and they decide that's the direction they're going, they really have a track record of sticking to it. So the results you notice speak for themselves. #1 in the world in terms of exports of a number of agricultural commodities, receiving billions in investment in electronics, and really one of the fastest growing exporters to the United States, $30 billion in exports to the U.S. in 2014.
This might date me a little bit, but I was back there in 2003 in Ho Chi Minh City, and one thing that I noticed was the number of, or the lack of big companies, first of all. And you go down the street and you see store after store after store, what looked to be family-owned businesses, restaurants, and cafe. And the amount of innovation and entrepreneurism, the sense of having your own business, has got to top the charts.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way...
Where does that come from?
Yeah, the way you see, I guess, that passion and drive of the Vietnamese people, it's well known. It's one of the reasons why I think foreign investors do look at Vietnam as a place where you want to tap into that energy and that growth. We're certainly seeing the emergence of a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises in Vietnam, doing business with some of the big multinationals are starting to invest there. And you really are seeing that entrepreneurial startup sort of community is also emerging in Vietnam as well. So again, very dynamic. And that's a young population, also that movement towards from the rural to urban areas, demand for new products, new services, really creating for a lot of dynamism in the economy.
Well, I mean, that brings us to a point where, I mean, you obviously know this, but I think for our audience, they may not know this. 92, 93 million people are in Vietnam. Yeah. The vast majority, a large majority, are in that younger generation.
Correct, yeah.
And we only say that because that is a generation that ultimately will go into the workforce. When you're thinking of a company to go into Vietnam, you want that young, hungry workforce. And that plays a huge role, doesn't it?
Totally agree. And in fact, I think one of the other key elements that's allowed for Vietnam to achieve these kind of successes are the kinds of investments that the government of Vietnam has made in terms of education. We're talking talent development and also vocational training. Even to the point of even beginning to evolve and change the curriculum for higher education. Yeah. So one of the things that we're seeing driving this is more FDI comes into Vietnam in higher skill areas. Vietnam is now producing higher skilled talent on its own, as well as Vietnamese students that are studying abroad, coming back and working in the country.
Politically, the U.S. hasn't had a great relationship with Vietnam in the past, but over the last decade, it's been quite the friendship. Are you surprised, as someone who's followed the history of this so closely?
Yeah, I think Vietnam has benefited from its location in Southeast Asia. It's part of the U.S. policy of rebalancing towards Asia vis-a-vis China. So as a result, you have seen a rapid growth in terms of that U.S.-Vietnam bilateral relationship. Military relations have improved. The fact that we're now working with Vietnam in the nuclear energy cooperation area is a huge deal. And then you throw in the fact that Vietnam is one of the 4 Southeast Asian countries involved in the TPP. Yeah. That's also quite significant.
I don't want to cheerlead too much on this because there are some very serious problems and concerns that critics have. They have talked about reforming the market sector. I'm talking about finance, opening up industries that have previously been closed. The criticism is that they're not moving fast enough. And I know it's odd because it's moving so fast already, but what do you think needs to be done to appease the critics?
Well, I think that's where people are kind of excited about Vietnam being part of the TPP negotiations. Because in many ways, if these negotiations do result in an agreement, TPP is going to become an additional catalyst to drive domestic reforms. And you're right, there are challenges that the government of Vietnam has to continue to kind of wrap its hands around and move progress on. So obviously, how the state-owned enterprise industry sector has to be reformed in a socially responsible way. So therefore, things like creating social safety nets is going to be very important. Again, to continue to drive towards, again, investing in education as well as infrastructure is also going to be one of those areas where Vietnam's got to do more if it's going to sustain.
So, okay, so they're collecting investment and people are building roads, bridges, highways, freeways, hospitals, and so on. But when you take a step back and you look at the role Vietnam has in Asia, I mean, all the way from Japan, China, all the way down south to Australia, what's the role of Vietnam, you think, going forward?
I think Vietnam's got a potential to be, for many other less developed countries, it can be a particularly interesting model to show how you can kind of evolve the economy. The fact that Vietnam has very robust ties with China, the United States, even as far as ways its relationship with African countries is also quite significant, particularly because of the success in agriculture. As we know, many LDCs around the world, that's still the area where countries are still struggling to make agriculture more productive. Vietnam's done a really good job in that space.
It's amazing how time has healed the disaster from 40 years ago. Marc, it's good to see you. Thank you very much.
Great to have you. Thank you.